much to the managerial and accounting stuff because it's frankly really boring. And entrepreneurship is supposed to be exciting, so that tends to get second attention. And so what happened was some of my people who were really early on in that movement, like their CEO would call me up 2, 3, 4 years later and say, hey, now that my company has some size, remember that thing you were talking about with something like management something? Like, could you come in and talk to us about that? And the first couple times I was like, I'm going to go in and say, I told you so, whatever. Like, that doesn't work very well as a consulting practice, so don't do that. But eventually I kind of got my head out of whatever the wrong orifice it was in, and started to go talk to people and actually have the conversation, not just with the founder and CEO, but the people that work there, and to realize that the conversation I'm having with a Dropbox or a One Kings Lane or a Twilio, it's like substantively the same as the conversation I'm having with Jeff Immel, which people generally don't believe that. I don't know, I'm kind of looking at people shaking their heads, it's not something that most people believe, but I'm here to say it's true. Because it doesn't matter if your company is 5 years old or 100 years old, if it's built to that same old-fashioned 20th century blueprint, you're going to get those same old-fashioned bureaucratic problems. And that's actually a really fun problem to work on.
Well, let's dive into the structural aspects of that.
So sure.
You've got a bunch of things that need to be in place in order to innovate, in order to form an entrepreneurial culture.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can isolate some of those for us, and I can prod you a little bit if you.
Oh yeah, well it's a huge question. I mean, the first thing we have to talk about is what's not required. Like most companies think that they don't have the right people to innovate, and it doesn't matter. Like when I talk senior leadership, like people that work for me, they're not going to do this. It's too radical. It's our people are conservative and they're this and they're that. And I'm like, well, can I go interview some of your employees? And I go talk to the employees, and they're like, well, we're on board with senior management. I mean, they're so we're all going like this. And I think the engineers are like, well, we of course embrace this absolutely with those designers. Last night I was talking to a team, which is like, all the designers are they're perfectionistic and they go on for blah, 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 blah. I'm like, can I go talk to some designers? And designers are like, those engineers, they would never go for that. It's like, so everyone's got a reason why it's somebody else's fault. So like, my experience has been, no matter what company, no matter how old, no matter how big, whatever, there are entrepreneurs that work in the company right now. Some of them are probably in this room, right? Some of you are that entrepreneurial person. If I had your personnel file from HR, it's like full of black marks, and does not play well with others, and they're always on the brink of being fired, and then massively promoted, and living that bipolar existence. Some of you know what I'm talking about. So the entrepreneurs are already there. The problem is that the system around them is not really being supported. So the question is what would it be like? And some of you who work in a large organization, ask yourself this question: what would it be like if you came into work one day, and your leadership told you, instead of sending you into battle with both hands tied behind your back and blindfolded, what if we actually created an environment where you were supported in doing the thing that you do best? What would that look like? And that's what I've had the chance to experiment with. So for example, entrepreneurship is a function of the corporation. I call it the missing function right now. It's as if you had a corporation that had no marketing department. And then, believe it or not, there was a time when companies didn't have a marketing department. Marketing is a relatively new specialty. It's a relatively new discipline. There was not always a chief marketing officer. Companies that don't have a marketing department, they still do marketing, but there's no one really in charge of it. And it's no one's in charge of the strategy of it. And there's no way to progress as a marketing person in your career path. And so other people have to kind of do it on the side. Some engineers do it, some product managers do it. You kind of make it all work. That's true for every function. Well, there's no entrepreneurship function. So what if your business card, most of you who are corporate entrepreneurs have a business card, and it says, so-and-so product manager or project manager or team leader or whatever it says. Some companies like chief engineer. What it doesn't say is founder, entrepreneur. It says something that, and if I go to your peers in the organization who have the same business card, the person who's the product manager or the brand manager for a product that has been in market for decades, and they're trying to get 1 extra point of market share or improve margins by 1%, their career path is supposed to be the same as yours. That makes no sense. When they pitch something to their boss, say, I think it's likely that 6 months from now we can achieve this financial performance for the company, their boss has an expectation that they're pretty much going to be right. The prediction might be off by 10% here or there, and that would be pretty bad. You miss your quarterly target by 10%, that's bad. If you're an entrepreneur, you're very likely to miss your quarterly targets by 3 orders of magnitude. I promised $1 million of revenue and I have 1,000. But I've learned so much. Right? You know what I'm talking about? You're gonna get fired. That's not the same career path, that's not the same accountability conversation, it's all messed up. So we have to recognize entrepreneurship as a corporate function. Team structure. The teams that I meet in corporate settings, and increasingly a lot of startups, which I think is really shocking, are part-time committees of functional specialists, which is just the worst. That's DMV level performance. Okay, that's not what you want. for a high-performance team. Multitasking between multiple projects, the research on this is super clear. Multitasking is a devil. It's not at all effective. And if the projects you're multitasking across are some innovation, some not, it's really ineffective. And just think about it from a career point of view. You're asking an engineer, could you spend 10% of your time on this like wacky thing that's probably not going to work, and it's very likely to blow up in your face and get you in trouble, and like 90% of your time on this thing that's almost certainly going to get you promoted and is basically guaranteed to work. So make sure you give them both fair attention. Like it's whatever you tell them, it should be 50-50 or 70-30 or 60. Like if it's anything but 100 on the innovation and 0 on the sustaining thing, like people naturally will gravitate to the thing that has clear career path beneficiary for them. So like that's a mess. So we've got to build a cross-functional team. So no multitasking, but also not single function. You can't just have only engineers or only product managers. A lot of companies I meet with, if you take the God's eye view and look down, imagine each of the functional silos like as a giant physical silo of like a Pringles top can. You pull it off and you have the God's eye view, look in. Inside the silo, you'll see this great iteration experimentation, design thinking, customer development, agile development, DevOps, lean manufacturing. Like I can name for every function the like well-established iterative methodology that people in that function use. And so you're like, wow, if I zoom out, this must be a very innovative and iterative company because all the people are working in iterative methodology. But how does work pass from function to function? It's a good old waterfall. They call it agile fall now in the agile world because like you're doing agile in your little silo, but then like you do your work product. Like any of you ever received the binder of a design specification from a highly iterative design thinking team? That the output is they physically give you a binder of 500 pages that tells you exactly what to do. And the implication is the learning is done. Everything has been figured out, it's in the binder. If you can't figure out if the product's not a failure, so you didn't read the binder closely enough. And so now the engineer's supposed to do agile, well 5 minutes in, they have a question like, well, okay, it says here that the thing should be like fast and cheap and this and that, and like actually physics requires 2 out of the 3. So which 2 out of 3 should we pick? And the designer's like, I gave you the binder, okay, it's done. You're supposed to figure it's like, you have to do learning and discovery through the whole development process, but our organizations are set up, past work one at a time. So that's like, we have to fix those very basic elements and say, look, we're going to take an engineer and a designer and a product manager, and every function that's going to be represented in this team, they need to be full-time on this team. That's a startup. Go to Silicon Valley, you don't wake up one day and like, hey, guess what? You've been assigned to a startup 10% of your time. Report to Sand Hill Road this morning. Like, that's not how it works. The people on there want to be there. They're thinking about it in the shower, and they have the kind of support of their peers. Say, we're going to figure this out together by whatever means necessary. Like, that's what a startup should look like, and there's no reason you can't have that, even in the most bureaucratic organizations I've seen it.
How do you give that cross-functional team the kind of urgency of a startup runway?
Yeah, that's very important. Most companies practice what I call entitlement funding. Entitlement funding is you have an annual appropriations process, kind of like Congress uses, and just as dysfunctional in most companies, where people battle it out politically to get their project onto the deck. You know what I'm talking about? Like there's like one master list of everything the company's going to do this year and how much money it's going to get. The politics of getting onto the deck is intense. You got to know how to work the system. I've seen this in companies as small as 100 people, like hot tech startups. This is how they do their annual appropriations. It's unbelievable. Once you get on the deck, you're basically entitled to funding in perpetuity. That's how it works. Like, unless you have a catastrophic failure. Next year, your budget might go up or down, but like, it's not gonna go from 100 to 0. It's gonna be like, okay, we'll go from 100 to 90 or to 110. Like, it's gonna be gradual quarterly adjustment. So the problem with that is, first of all, teams that have entitlement funding have no sense of urgency. Because like, what's the difference in getting it done this year or next year? Like, in fact, if the job is kind of a cushy job, like maybe putting it off a little bit might be nice. So no urgency, and also, you can't do anything cheap. So I go to companies all the time and I say, listen, can we just do an MVP? Like, I want to spend $100 million on this awesome product. I'm like, great, can we do an MVP for $100,000? And we talk about that. Even if I get the team to agree that it can be done, there's no mechanism for spending $100,000 on anything. If I go to the management and say, we need to put a project on the deck to do an MVP for $100,000, everybody knows there ain't no such thing as $100,000. It's a $100,000 annuity in perpetuity. So it's much more expensive. So it creates incredible conservatism. The alternative is to say, we're going to do what we call metered funding, where the team, you give a team, you say, listen, here's your budget. It's fixed at $100,000 or whatever. If ideally, it includes not just development costs, but personnel costs too. Every cost, anything the company wants to say, listen, you're a startup. It's your money, spend it on whatever you want. But do not, under any circumstances, come back to me and ask me for more money unless you have validated learning, that you're on the right track. That's like, whatever you want to say about Sand Hill Road VCs, the one thing VCs do extremely well is when they write you a check, they rarely ask you for the money back. You know, the money goes from their bank account to yours, and it's your money. That's good. There's no like, hey, can we have 10% back because we had a bad quarter? That's not how it works. But God help you if you try to raise more money, you haven't learned anything. I mean, it is almost impossible. When you create that mechanism for teams, it absolutely radically transforms the way that they operate. It's actually, it's so powerful, it's almost, people almost don't believe. Like, I've been accused of putting something in people's water. When we have teams come in and do like a lean startup workshop, and their behavior changes so radically, so quickly, that people are like, what did you do to them? Just actually gave them the opportunity to do real work. Pretty cool.
Another thing, though, that occurs to me that's very different in an established organization than in a startup is around the issue of ownership.
Yeah, very important.
How do you give teams in a larger organization skin in the game?
Yeah. The concept is called a stake in the outcome, and there's a great book with that title. Of course, I live in Silicon Valley. Most of the money I've made in my life is through equity ownership, and I'm a big believer in equity ownership as a way of giving people, I mean, it's just like the easiest, most literal way to say you have a stake in the outcome. You literally own part of the outcome. So a lot of companies believe they can't do that. Like, I talk to a lot of people, like finance would never go for it, but I have sat down with corporate CFOs at the highest level and said, here is the way I think people in your team should be compensated. And they're like, well, you'll never get the divisions to go for that. But financially speaking, it's easy to arrange. Like, it can be done. It's not that hard. But it's actually not that important. The research on financial bonuses and financial compensation is that, like, money motivates people to a certain degree, but not nearly as much as feeling a sense of mission and a sense of ownership in creating something that is great. So I've seen a lot of teams, and including, like, if you look at the teams from the White House we were just talking about, and people who are in a government setting, but they're on a mission to do something that's really worthwhile. And the key to having that feeling of ownership is, first of all, the dedication is critical. Clear leader. You are the founder of this team. If this thing succeeds, you will get the credit, not your boss. Like, a lot of people have a deal with their boss. It's like, if it goes bad, it's my fault. If it goes well, you get the credit. It's a very demotivating deal. One of my favorite old Toyota techniques back in the day for Toyota was inside the company, they don't refer to the Camry or the Prius. They call it so-and-so son's car. It's named after the person who was the chief engineer for that vehicle, and that's how it's referred to. So it's not that the person has equity ownership in the Camry, it's that they have the moral authority to say, my name is on this project. And if you're trying to say, look, I think we should make a design compromise that doesn't make sense for customers, you can say, listen, if you want to get me fired, you can. You can go to my boss and advocate for me being fired, but you can't get me to put my name on this compromise. I don't think it's right. And the sense of ownership that engenders is so much more than what most people have in their kind of part-time committee teams.
How do you deal